Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 12 waiver wire targets for the 2019 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about waiver wire targets for the running back, wide receiver, quarterback, tight end, and defensive positions going into Week 12. And as we approach that journey, talking about all the different waiver wire targets, we're going to be talking about some Week 11 review and highlights in terms of players who had monster weeks, then talking about some news around the National Football League as we enter Week 12 in terms of injuries and different things that you are in need of knowing. Also, before we begin, let me remind all of you, if you haven't yet already, click that subscribe button, join the community, help us get to that 13,000 subscriber mark. It would be absolutely incredible. I appreciate every single one of you who subscribe to the channel and support, so thank you again. Also, don't forget to click the bell notification button to staying up to date on my latest content. And if you like today's video, please do not forget to click the like button. Thank you very much. Hey guys, how's it going? Hope everyone's doing well. All right, so let's get right into it. Let's talk about Week 12 running back targets right off the top. Let's talk about Johnathan Williams. You may be thinking, Andrew, who's Johnathan Williams? Well, Johnathan Williams is a running back for the Indianapolis Colts. Now, for those of you who are Marlon Mack owners, you'll know that Marlon Mack had a huge Week 11 with over 100 rushing yards on 14 carries, had a rushing touchdown, and was absolutely dominating the Jacksonville Jaguars until he sustained an injury. What injury? He broke his hand earlier this morning, had surgery on his hand, according to Frank Reich, head coach of the Indianapolis Colts. They're saying that his progress is to be determined. Obviously, they're keeping the window open just in case they make the playoffs in order for him to come back. But in terms of fantasy football, I think his season is over. And I think Johnathan Williams, now that Jordan Wilkins is a little bit banged up, is the running back of the future for this team, at least this season. As of right now, what do we see from Johnathan Williams? The guy came in 13 carries, over 100 rushing yards, had a receptions for 31 rushing yards, had a big performance when they needed him most. He came in and he picked up exactly where Marlon Mack left off, which is exactly what we want to see. And let's be honest, for those of you who are David Johnson owners, James Conner owners, Marlon Mack owners, Kerryon Johnson owners, you are struggling to find another starting running back to help you out rest of season. And I think a guy like Johnathan Williams can be that. Anytime you have an opportunity to pick up a waiver wire beast like this that is going to be given, or at least, starting running back opportunity, it is something of value. I think this week, more than many of the other weeks prior, is extremely valuable because there are a lot of waiver wire additions to be made that are going to pay dividends as we progress and go through the fantasy playoffs. There's a lot of big players here that are going to be contributing for teams. So again, Johnathan Williams is my number one at the running back position for Week 12 at the running back position. Let's go ahead and talk about my number two, Bo Scarborough, former running back of Alabama. Has jumped around the last couple of years, hasn't really been able to find a home. Earlier this week, Matt Patricia and the Detroit Lions signed him to the roster, cut Paul Perkins. Interestingly enough, Paul Perkins last week, that was a mistake. And this week, or at least in Week 11, Bo Scarborough had a very good performance. Overall, a big contributor, had double-digit carries, pretty good yard per carry average, had himself a touchdown. Sure, it was against the Dallas Cowboy defense that has not been good against the run all season long, but that's not, a big deal. This is a starting running back who is going to get the early down work as the season progresses. And if in fact the information about Matthew Stafford's back is to be true, he's not going to be seeing the field for perhaps even the rest of the season. They're probably going to need Jeff Driskel to be the starting quarterback for the rest of the year, and they're going to rely upon the running game. Bo Scarborough is going to be the guy that leads that with J.D. McKissic behind him, but I think Bo Scarborough is, again, a starting running back with opportunity. Looks a lot better than Ty Johnson did with all the opportunities he got. So Bo Scarborough, again, my number two running back on the week. Moving on to number three, Jaylen Samuels. I wanted to mention Jaylen Samuels because, sure, what if someone in your league dropped him? Andrew, should I be picking him up? Absolutely. This is a guy that in a half PPR, full PPR scoring format is extremely valuable, and still in terms of own percentage in Yahoo leagues, when I'm looking at it, not owned in very many leagues. This is a guy that is getting a lot of work with the uncertainty of James Conner's injury. According to what his Week 12 status is, according to the team, it's up in the air. That doesn't sound good to me, especially considering he came in and got hurt so quickly in Week 11 against the Cleveland Browns on Thursday Night Football after a week off, right? So obviously he needs more time off. Jaylen Samuels is going to be the starting running back of this team for the coming weeks, and I think he is, a guy that you should have on roster, and if he's available, pick him up. Moving on, number four, a guy that I talked about during the Hidden Gems of Week 11. If you haven't checked that out, extremely important episode, but obviously a lot of the guys that I mentioned there are probably already picked up by now. You should have already picked up Derrius Guice. Sure, he came out and didn't get the early down work, especially early in the game. It was a lot of Adrian Peterson, but eventually, as the game progressed, they got Derrius Guice more and more implemented. They got him at 10 plus touches on the ground. Sure, he could have been more successful on the ground, but then again, it's his first game back in a while, since week 1. And then he had his big breakout play. I was hoping that he would have one of these plays, and he surely did. He had a 40-yard screen pass to the house after the Jets sent a blitz at Dwayne Haskins. Luckily, Derrius Guice was able to outrun everybody down the sideline, score himself a touchdown. For those of you who picked him up, played him, paid dividends already. The upcoming schedule, as I've talked about in the Hidden Gems, very favorable for this guy. So again, if he is still available in your league, perhaps go ahead and pick up a guy like Derrius Guice. Moving on, number 5, Nyheim Hines. Nyheim Hines plays for the Colts. He's a receiving back primarily and predominantly. Sure, he's going to get some work on the ground like he did this Sunday. I think he scored a rushing touchdown. But he is the receiving back of this team. If, in fact, another injury is to go down, sure, Nyheim Hines is the next man up after that. He's going to probably be more implemented in this offense, see more snaps now that Marlon Mack is gone. But again, Johnathan Williams is going to be number 1. Nyheim Hines, if he's available, is a decent PPR play. If, in fact, they're going to lean upon him more and more in the passing game, which I believe they potentially could in the coming weeks. But then again, we're just going to have to wait and see. As of right now, who else could have been at the number 5 spot? Potentially Tarik Cohen, but I know a lot of people picked him up because of David Montgomery's uncertainty this week. And I did mention Tarik Cohen last week as a pickup. But other than that, moving on to the number 6 running back target, Handcuffs. What does that mean? Anybody who is the initial straight next man up to your starting running back. Just like a Johnathan Williams, right? He was the next man up for Marlon Mack. Who's the next man up for Zeke? I talked about this in Hidden Gems. Tony Pollard. Tony Pollard had a monster week. On 4 receptions, had almost just as good of a week as Zeke had in fantasy. Yeah. Gus Edwards came in after Mark Ingram had a extremely good week, especially receiving the ball. Gus Edwards came in and had a monster performance, 17 plus fantasy points. There are a lot of handcuffs that need to be picked up because they're extremely valuable, and to make sure that if and when, perhaps, God forbid, something happens to your blue chip all-star running back, you have their handcuff rest of the season. I think this is the time to go ahead and pick those guys up, get them on roster, make sure that they are helping you out. Worst case scenario, you'll be insured. All right, moving on. Let's talk about some wide receivers going into week 12. Again, starting off with number 1, Deebo Samuel. We talked about him during the Hidden Gems video. Because of the injuries to Emmanuel Sanders, George Kittle, there was a lot of uncertainty of what was going to happen. Somehow, Emmanuel Sanders still ended up playing, but I was still confident in Deebo Samuel's ability to continue to step up and progress as a number 2 or potentially a number 1 wide receiver for this team. He is a number 1 outside receiver. Emmanuel Sanders is typically a slot guy. And as of right now, Deebo Samuel, especially from yesterday's performance against the Arizona Cardinals, has continued to prove in each of the last 3 weeks that he is getting more work, he is being trusted more, and he is one of Jimmy Garoppolo's favorite targets. And going forward, this is a guy, again, could have a very good schedule or very good performances depending on the schedule. And I think he's going to be relied upon with all the injuries taking place to that offense to be a big contributor going forward. So again, if he's not owned, I looking at his own percentage, it's not even that high. As much as I've talked about him for the last 2+ weeks, Deebo Samuel still needs to be picked up by a lot of you, especially those of you who didn't watch the Hidden Gems video. Moving on. Number 2, Devonta Parker. Somehow Devonta Parker, Deebo Samuel, they're like 50% owned, 40% owned. It's like, how is this possible? Devonta Parker's having incredible weeks for the last 6 weeks. Sure, in a half PPR, it's not as beautiful. In a standard, it's not as great. But he is getting huge target counts, yardage counts, and especially against good cornerbacks, he is the only receiving option that is having a consistent week-to-week basis for the Miami Dolphins. And again, I understand Devonta Parker in the past, especially in years past, has not been consistent, but in the last 6-7 weeks has been nothing but consistent. He has been the number 1 of this team, continues to see great amount of targets with Preston Williams gone, with really no running game in this offense. He's had some pretty big performances, and he's going to probably continue to do so with such a favorable schedule. He needs to be picked up absolutely. Moving on, number 3, Randall Cobb. Speaking of having big performances, Randall Cobb, back-to-back weeks, huge performances, over 100 yards each of the last 2 games. Sure, his target count, his reception count, it's not as high as we would have liked it to be, but he is still seeing a huge amount of opportunity, and he's making most of it. A lot of his depth of target is downfield, making huge plays, but even then, there are a lot of receiving options on this team. There's Zeke, there's Pollard, there's Cooper, there's Gallup, there's Jarwin, there's Witten. Yet somehow Randall Cobb is continuously, producing in this offense. With Dak Prescott throwing the ball for 900 yards in the last 2 weeks, it's no surprise that is what they're leaning upon. They are leaning upon Dak Prescott's arm to carry this team, to try to get them to the promised land. And they're going to have to continue to do so because Zeke hasn't looked good. And I think a number 3 wide receiver for the Cowboys, sure, in the past was not as valuable. But I think Randall Cobb the last 2 weeks has kind of proven why his value can be sustainable, considering how good this offense has been in the passing game. All right, moving on. Let's talk about number 4, Darius Slayton. Again, a lot of people aren't talking about Darius Slayton because he had a bye week in week 11. But in week 10, the dude was the number 1 wide receiver. I mean, he had 2 touchdowns, had over 14 targets, 10 receptions, over 100 yards, had a huge week with Daniel Jones and the New York Giants. Going into week 12, and the rest of the season, their schedule is very favorable. And I do think Darius Slayton, again, if he had not been picked up last week, this is a guy that we need to address and pick up now if, in fact, you are going to take a gamble on this offense and try to see if we can at least get some sort of value out of a guy like this who is, as of right now, one of, if not the favorite target of Daniel Jones this season, considering all the injuries that have taken place with Sterling Shepard, Evan Ingram, Saquon Barkley. Slayton and Golden Tate have been really carrying this team, and Slayton's a guy that certainly needs to be owned more than he is already. Moving on. James Washington. Okay, so what I heard earlier today, in terms of news, Juju Smith-Schuster sustained an injury, obviously had his concussion, but he also sustained a knee injury in that Thursday night game. Also, Deontay Johnson got hit so hard in the side of the head that his ear started bleeding during that game. You all saw that dirty hit, but Myles Garrett went ahead and hit somebody with a helmet, and we all forgot about that dirty hit. So, James Washington, next man up. They obviously have Deion Kane, but I think James Washington, we've already seen him get more and more implementation in this offense and be one of Mason Rudolph's favorite targets. As right, Mason Rudolph doesn't look like he's being suspended, so I think James Washington going forward is a great wide receiver pickup potentially and play in the coming weeks because of schedules. And because, to be honest, if he's the only wide receiver there, he's going to get a pretty good amount of targets. A lot of opportunity leads to a lot of success. Moving on, the last wide receiver option, Tim Patrick of the Denver Broncos. Now, we haven't talked about Tim Patrick since literally last season this time. Last season this time was when Emmanuel Sanders was down with an injury. They traded Demaryius Thomas, and really, we didn't know who was going to step up for the Denver Broncos. Was it going to be Hamilton? Was it going to be Sutton? Was it going to be Patrick? Tim Patrick is a receiver that, honestly, if he is going to see a similar amount of targets that he did this week with Brandon Allen, rest of season can be a valuable wide receiver 3 prospect and potentially could end up trending in that direction. Tim Patrick, again, this is a very little known guy, but going forward, if he is going to see more and more work in this offense, I just want to keep everybody aware. You don't have to go ahead and instantly pick this guy up, but be aware of his value and his potential for the coming weeks, because if in fact he continues to trend in the right direction, he could be of value in the fantasy playoffs potentially as a guy that in his second year could be of value trying to get more experience with the rookie quarterback. All right, let's go ahead and move on. Let's talk about some tight end waiver wire targets for week 12. Starting off with number 1, Kyle Rudolph. Is it really a surprise? Not really. We talked about Kyle Rudolph last week. Kyle Rudolph has scored 5 touchdowns in the last 5 weeks. Obviously, that is something that is not a joke. He is continuously seeing a lot of work because of the absence of an Adam Thielen and because of how strong the running game is for the Minnesota Vikings. When you are such a run-heavy team, a lot of teams are committing to the run, and they're looking at a tight end. The tight end's going to down block and then slip off for a route. A lot of the time, Kyle Rudolph, Irv Smith are finding a lot of value, especially when the play action is being utilized. And Kyle Rudolph, in the last couple of weeks, has been very consistent. This past week had himself another good week. He's my number 1 tight end target on the week. Moving on to Ross Dwelley. If, in fact, George Kittle's not available, Ross Dwelley is going to be a pretty big pickup and play. He should have already been picked up if you were a Kittle owner, but if he had not been picked up and you're not a Kittle owner, but you need a tight end, this is not a bad guy to pick up. Again, they played against their easiest match of the season. They played against the Cardinals, and the Cardinals suck, especially against the tight end. But Ross Dwelley had his 2 touchdowns, perfectly fine. But if Kittle's out again, this is a guy that is going to be targeted heavily because we know that this offense needs to target the tight end position to at least function as an offense. So as of right now, Ross Dwelley, another one of these tight end targets that you might want to be considering. Ryan Griffen as my number 3. Now that the legend of Chris Herndon's completely gone, sent to the IR with some rib injury, Ryan Griffen has come back and he's doing it again. he is catching the ball 4 or 5 times a game, and he's scoring touchdowns, and he's having big yardage totals, and he is being a very good contributor for this offense, even if he is not the tight end catching a touchdown in the end zone. Eventually, he's getting those big yardage plays, and he is surprisingly being a very good, has been a pretty good option in the last couple of weeks. Obviously, when Herndon came back, it was a little slow, but since his absence, and when there was no Herndon earlier in the weeks, we saw Ryan Griffen be a pretty big contributor in this offense. I think going forward could be a good play considering schedule. There is no really, like Robbie Anderson caught the ball once for a touchdown, big whoop. Le'Veon Bell was okay. Bilal Powell saw more touches. Outside of Bell, Crowder, it's Ryan Griffen as the number 3 option. Not a bad option, to be honest, in my opinion, especially considering they play against the Raiders. The Raiders have been very bad against tight ends in the last couple of weeks. All right, moving on. Noah Fant, number 4. Noah Fant saw like 10 plus targets. That is something that, as of right now, and he even saw the game-winning target. They tried to throw it to him in a one-on-one coverage after he committed offensive PI. Again, Noah Fant's going to learn as the season progresses, but at least he's getting a lot of opportunity, and that's all we can ask for. And that's exactly what I'm happy about. I want to pick up Noah Fant because of the potential of his opportunity with a guy like Brandon Allen continuing to look for a safety blanket like Fant. Fant had like 12 targets, 4 receptions. That needs to get better, certainly, but it's a give and take. We're eventually going to have to get to the point where the quarterback needs to throw more accurate passes and Fant needs to make more plays. But once we get there, we're going to have a pretty good tight end. So as of right now, Noah Fant, my number 4 option, not bad. Moving on to number 15. 15, 5. I don't know why I said 15. Oh, I know why. It's because Cameron Brate had like 14 targets? 15 targets? What an insane week, right? Cameron Brate had a huge amount of targets for this team. And Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, yeah, you know what? We had okay weeks. What the heck? Cameron Brate out of nowhere. After O.J. Howard had one of the worst receptions led to an interception. He tried to catch the ball behind his back and literally popped it up for Demario Davis. It's something O.J. Howard would do. That's it. That's only something O.J. Howard would do. Cameron Brate, big contributor. Can he be that for the coming weeks? Potentially. We're just going to have to wait and see. Again, this is another one of those gambles. Some weeks he shows up, had 0 points. Some weeks he shows up and has a huge tight end week. I don't know what we're going to see this week, but I think the matchup is good enough to where there's a potential. Moving on, Tyler Eifert, number 6. Tyler Eifert saw a decent amount of targets himself. Obviously needs to see more and more, but the way it's trending as of right now with Ryan Finley, obviously it's an easier matchup against like the Raiders, but Tyler Eifert will get more and more work as the season progresses. So if you are in real need of a tight end, he's always an option. All right, let's go ahead and move on. Let's talk about quarterbacks here. Starting off with number 1, Jimmy Garoppolo. Jimmy G had a huge week. Am I surprised? Kind of, because without a healthy Emmanuel Sanders, without a Kittle, without a Brate, he still managed to have a huge week, even without Joe Staley in the lineup. The left tackle was out. Didn't need him. This team, they stepped up and they fought through adversity. After losing to the Seahawks in overtime on Monday, they came back out and they picked up a huge late fourth quarter win. Jeff Wilson Jr., 25-yard reception touchdown at the end. Big performance. Going into the next coming week, Sunday Night Football against the Green Bay Packers should be fun. Jimmy Garoppolo, not a bad pickup. Then we have Baker Mayfield this coming week playing against Cincinnati. Not a bad matchup at all. I think Baker Mayfield could have a good week there. Then we'd have Sam Darnold playing against the Raiders. That's a good matchup. Derek Carr playing against the Jets, vice versa. Then we have Nick Foles playing. Nick Foles, again, not a bad week. Could have been better. Not a bad week, though. Nick Foles gets to take on the Tennessee Titans, see what kind of jazz we got there. Maybe Ryan Tannehill is a guy that you might want to pick up in that matchup. Could be a good option considering he was dropped. In case he was dropped in your league or something like that. But he's been pretty good in his leagues. And then we have Jeff Driskel, who somehow is continuously finding himself some pretty good value. Despite being the backup quarterback and having very little experience in the National Football League, he has been pretty good. And to be honest, he could end up putting together a couple good performances here and there as the week progresses, or as the weeks progress. So I'm excited about that. But at least he's bringing value to guys like Galladay and or Marvin Jones. Marvin Jones 2 touchdowns yesterday, so that's pretty huge. But either way, those are some quarterback options for you going into Week 12 for those of you looking for streaming targets. Because as we all know, I think we have the Chiefs on bye week. We have the Chargers on bye week. Goodness, am I going to really forget who the last 2 teams are? I think it's the Vikings. And then who is the last team? Chiefs, Chargers, Vikings, and Cardinals. Thank you very much. All right, moving on. Let's go ahead and talk about some defensive waiver wire targets. Yes, this is a shorter video, but again, there's nothing really much else to talk about. We're just talking about some waiver wire pickups, guys that I suggest you go after. Starting off with number 1 on the defensive position, the Atlanta Falcons defense. That is correct. Never have I ever said this before this season, that the Atlanta Falcons defense needs to be picked up and played. But by all means, the last 2 weeks, they have been elite defensively. They have stopped Drew Brees. They have absolutely, they ended Kyle Allen's career after this season. They really did. They forced 4 interceptions from the kid. I mean, he could not throw a regular pass to save his life. That defense was swarming. And they have been really good. And who did they get to play against? Mr. Jameis Winston, that cannot save his life and will consistently throw interceptions no matter what. No matter what. So, I think the Atlanta Falcons, not a bad option. Moving on, the New Orleans Saints this coming week. New Orleans Saints. Who do we get to take on in Week 12? Playing against the Carolina Panthers. I mean, they forced Jameis to throw picks. Why not force Kyle Allen to throw picks? That's all I'm saying. You know, even with Kyle Allen throwing 4 interceptions, Christian McCaffrey was still the best running back. Had 121 receiving yards and still had a huge game. Not a surprise. Moving on to Detroit Lions. They get to take on the Washington Redskins. I think Dwayne Haskins could be taken advantage of. And if, in fact, that is going to take place, the Detroit Lions could come up with some big plays there and be a good contributing defense in Week 12. Moving on, the Tennessee Titans. They get to take on the Jaguars. I think vice versa could be the way, but I think the Tennessee Titans are going to run the ball heavily with Derrick Henry all over the Jaguars in Tennessee, and it's going to be a one-sided matchup. And I think the Tennessee Titans defense, they could step up and they could make some plays. So we're going to go ahead and see what's going to happen there. But they always got the potential to make some plays defensively and put up some pretty good points. Moving on. Number 5, the Buffalo Bills taking on a rookie quarterback, Brandon Allen, in Buffalo. I think if there's some weather concerns, it could force a run-heavy game. If that's the case, then we got ourselves, unfortunately, Phillip Lindsay and Royce Freeman running all over the Buffalo Bills defense that really can't stop the run at times. But as of right now, I still think they're a pretty good defensive play. They've been pretty good in the last couple of weeks, and I don't think this week they're going to shy away from potentially having themselves a good performance. And in the last defense I wanted to mention, the Philadelphia Eagles were not bad against the New England Patriots. Sure, they didn't get the job done and weren't able to win the game, but when you can hold the Patriots to a 17-point week where Brate doesn't throw a touchdown, that is impressive. And I think in the coming weeks, sure, the Seattle Seahawks matchup this week is difficult, but in the coming weeks after that, like we talked about in Hidden Gems, they're going to, from weeks 13, 14, 15, and potentially 16, have very good slate of games and have huge performances as a defense for your fantasy playoffs. And that is it. Those are the waiver wire targets for Week 12. This week, for the running back, wide receiver, tight end, quarterback, and defensive positions. Again, all these players, I think there are some huge players here that need to be picked up. The Johnathan Williams, the Scarborough, the Deebo, the Devonta Parkers of the world. Those are guys that are going to be huge contributors in the fantasy playoffs. I really do believe so. I think defenses like the Philadelphia Eagles, big contributors. But only time will tell. There are always players that sure could have one good week and then disappear. And hopefully that's not the case here. Hopefully these are players that will have longevity throughout the rest of the season, and that's what I'm hoping for. So thank you again for watching, everybody. I appreciate you guys spending your time watching today's video. Sure, it was a little bit shorter than usual, but again, short, concise, to the point. Hopefully this helps you guys out, kind of determining what you need to pick up at the waiver wire position for this week. Again, thank you everybody for watching. If you haven't yet already, click that subscribe button, join the community, click that like button if you like today's video. And if you haven't yet already, Patreon link is down in the description for those of you looking to get all of your 2019 fantasy football questions answered. Until tomorrow, where we'll be talking about running back, starter sits. Thank you everybody again, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. Peace.